UK Lawyers for Israel, is that right?
That's absolutely right.
Ladies and gentlemen, Natasha Hausdorff in the house. Thank you for being here.
Ami, thank you. It really is my pleasure to be here.
Let's start with some drama on Twitter. I came across a clip yesterday of you talking to Ian Dale. Did I get that right?
That's also correct.
Who was flexing his impartiality and unbiasedness by basically coming after you for having you on to give an alternative opinion to a previous guest. And when you gave that opinion, he went absolutely ape on you. What happened?
I was a bit baffled by what unravelled, to be perfectly frank, but the interview was about Israel's decision to deny entry to two British members of parliament with a long track record of anti-Israel statements and calling for a boycott. And as part of Israel's laws of entry, there is the provision to deny entry to anyone who has actively been calling for a boycott. It's very similar, in fact, to the UK's own statutory provisions that allow the government or the Home Office to deny entry to anyone they consider not to be conducive to the public good. So that's essentially the equivalent of the statutory setup in Israel. And it was unfortunately in the context of explaining, first of all, the reasons that these members of parliament had been refused entry, the legal justification for that, but also the bizarre misrepresentations that had been associated with this case, that, as you have indicated, matters became slightly more heated. And ultimately, I was kicked off the radio programme for seeking to call out those misrepresentations and the unfair comparisons that I felt the producer or the presenter was seeking to draw.
Can you imagine a trip with these two ladies? It was two women MPs?
They were both female MPs,
It would have been a lot of fun going to Israel with two pro-BDS activists. I can't imagine it would be fun at all to walk through the shuk with these people.
I didn't think they had much intention of spending any time in Israel, interestingly enough. They claimed to be on a parliamentary delegation to Judea and Samaria, or what they called the West Bank.
Nicely said.
So that was actually part and parcel of the difficulty, because they presented themselves to immigration authorities. They said, we're here on a parliamentary delegation. That was checked, and there was no record of such delegation because there was none to Israel.
Could they just hang out in the airport for like 6 months?
Well,
did they have to go home?
They were offered accommodation, according to the Israelis, which they refused. And then they were put on a plane at the State of Israel's expense, which I think is perhaps kinder than the U.S. immigration authorities might act.
So it was at the Dan Prima or the Panorama, and they were not okay with that. They said, impal or bust.
Yeah, the breakfast there or not, we're not.
King David or bust, this is a travesty. But this guy, I don't know, we've seen this sometimes with British journalists, I won't have to name names, but this guy in particular seemed to have you on simply to flex that he was, as he called himself, I've been very pro-Israel, but if you say anything about my previous guests again, I will have to kick you off the show. That's 3 times. And all you were saying was offering your perspective. It wasn't ad hominem. It wasn't a personal attack on a previous guest. And every time you stated this viewpoint, which was your intention to have you on, he then just kicked you off the show. Is that what you think is motivating people like that?
Well, it's helpful to have your perspective on this because obviously I can't be entirely impartial, and I was there in the moment. But I do think that it is a phenomenon that I experience across various broadcasters, frankly, when called upon to do these interviews. I mean, the last interview I did on the BBC, Christian Fraser was turning the sound down while speaking over me, over the answers to the questions that he'd been posing. So it's not uncommon. I think it's all the more important to be continuing to take up these opportunities when they present themselves to me and calling out the false information, putting forth the factual, legal, historical context to enable listeners for BBC, for LBC across the United Kingdom and hopefully increasingly across America to have access to the correct analysis and narrative.
I find that with Israel it happens a lot where there will be these critiques of things that Israel does, and it's always left out that every country in the Western world has these legal precedents and everyone just conveniently leaves it out. Is there any other examples of that? Like, I know that with Israel, they speak about certain things. You know that this is not allowed in Israel, that you can't, I don't know, whether it's certain civil issues, and everyone's like, I remember hearing even Alan Dershowitz years ago say, are you aware that America has the exact same law? Like, I'm blanking on what the exact statute was, but do you find that that's often the case when people level these kind of accusations against Israel on a legal basis, that they're always leaving out that just like the UK has practices for letting people in, the United States has certain, standards for who can enter and who cannot enter.
Absolutely.
They always leave that out.
There are countless examples. It's the case across the board. I mean, one pretty controversial one a few years ago was the nation-state law, in which Israel, as part of its codification process of its constitution, was clear that Israel's a nation-state of the Jewish people, and there were provisions for the official language, the official symbols of the state, and the world seemed up in arms about it. There were some important commentators and legal analysts, including Professor Eugene Kontorovich, who pointed out, chapter and verse, the constitutions of many, many European states, other states, that included identical provisions. I mean, likewise, when people claim that Israel is an apartheid state because it makes a distinction between Israeli citizens and non-Israeli citizens, that is a distinction that every state it embraces. I'm here as a British citizen. I don't share the same rights and privileges that you as Americans enjoy. That is standard practice. But for some reason, when it comes to Israel, reason is thrown out of the window.
Eugene. Love Eugene. I've been a fan for a long time.
You should have him on the show, sure.
How bad is it in England right now? Like, from afar, it seems like there are no real allies publicly, like Douglas Murray, but it feels, from what I hear, it's
he spends most of the time in the US.
Well, it feels pretty.
For you, yes. I would never go back there. It's a cesspool. Anyway, sorry.
It seems pretty dark there for Jews at the moment.
And there's not a lot of sunlight to begin with.
New York is pretty.
That was funny.
New York is pretty cold for April at the moment. I mean, let's
yeah, that's true. That's true.
throwing stones from glass houses.
But culturally speaking, the whole UK has fallen. Like, how close is that to reality?
So it's interesting to consider the campus context, because America was leading the way on encampments, and in fact tomorrow I'll be speaking at Columbia Law School specifically for the National Security Law Program, and I've been told I'm going into the belly of the beast.
Cue the protests.
We shall see. It would be great if they would come and listen. That would be a really nice change, and they might indeed learn something. But across the board, my perspective is undoubtedly tainted by the work that I'm doing with this incredible organisation I'm privileged to be involved with, UK Lawyers for Israel. So we certainly see the worst of the worst, from the experiences of students to employees facing anti-Semitism in the workplace, to local government BDS resolutions, to everything that's going on with this Labour government and the fixation of many of their members of parliament on Israel, to the fact that we've had, for the first time, independent MPs that were elected on a Gaza-only platform. So there has substantially been, undeniably, a shift. And I think I certainly see the worst of it. Whether or not that's recoverable, I don't know. And there are many who are far more educated than me on these issues, on the politics of it, and the processes that are necessary to recover, who say there is no way back, because the only means of stemming the tide of this trajectory would be inherently illiberal. We're not that sort of country. So
you mean by like just deporting people who have repugnant views towards the West?
If they happen to be British citizens, that would be unthinkable.
Right.
I remember I was teaching in a school in 2008 in the city centre of London in Bethnal Green. And I was there to set up a debating club, and we were doing current affairs, and the sentiment that some of these kids were coming out with, McDonald's pays the Jews to kill all the Arabs, was extraordinary. Now, it was 98% ethnic minorities, but I could tell that a few kids in the class might be bringing that sort of sentiment in from home, but unchecked, the rest of the class would go back thinking this. And it was essentially a breeding ground in the centre of London for extremist views and intolerance. And I raised these concerns with the link teacher that I had, who was responsible for the English curriculum, who said that they were really struggling with set texts, including The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, which is the Holocaust from a child's perspective, because the kids would come out with, if only Hitler were here today, he'd sort out the Jews once and for all. Now, I wrote about my concerns that summer when I was working with Douglas, actually, at the Centre for Social Cohesion. And it was 5 years later that school, Bethnal Green Technology College, became famous. It was renamed Bethnal Green Academy, and it was the school that those 3 girls left to join ISIS. So the message that I took from those experiences is that we have had, second, third generation British citizens being radicalised in country, in the city centres of some of our largest population centres. And that is the core of, I think, so much of what we are seeing now explode on the surface. How one grapples with that is an enormous question, which I certainly don't pretend to have the answers to.
Yeah, so not good.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that and think, we got a comment on we get a lot of scary comments on our YouTube and Instagram, but
Noses, just nose emojis.
yeah, they don't like my nose for some reason. I don't understand. The most poignant one we got, I think, was like, don't worry, in 25 years, like, we'll be running the country and everyone will know the truth about the Jews. And I was like, damn, that's a good point. Where, like, I look at Britain now and then look at America and I'm like, all the kids in like elementary school now are going to take all this stuff for granted. And when they are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, like, I feel like it's going to look like Britain does now. And it's, like, pretty scary.
Yeah.
For what it's worth, I think your noses are both very distinct.
Thank you so much.
Thank
it's
you.
bulbous, but I don't have the heat. It's more signature.
Well, I got work done on it to get it like this.
He has more of the poster.
The signature
kind of
nose.
thing. But I'm
Sure.
proud of that. We're proud of that.
Sure.
Oh, man. All right. Well, anyway, that is spooky. But the question is always, is there a silent majority of the common sense people that really know better than this? But then the question is, it doesn't take much for a regime to take over a society, even if a majority population would never espouse those views. Like, at what point in the cultural epicenters and political epicenters does it take to turn a culture completely the other way? Even if you polled 75% of Americans now, which they've done, it's not Twitter. Twitter is the Third Reich at this point, but majority of Americans support Israel against Hamas if you ask them, and then they just want to go back to their own lives. But it's this constant debate over, things get bad one small step at a time, and it doesn't take much for a society to completely be overrun with values that are completely antithetical to it. So
It's the frog in the boiling water.
Things get bad one small step at a time. I always say that. It's a Jordan Peterson quote. But yes, the frog in the boiling water, turning it up gradually, eventually the frog dies.
But you have expertise other than just being from England. So
Yes, let's
talk about everything else.
I first discovered you in that monk debate with Douglas against Mehdi Hassan. But I wanted to talk about the state of debate right now, especially as it's happening online, where a lot of people in the pro-Israel side, the pro-Jewish side, just to speak loosely, are putting a lot of energy into proving who is hateful. And I'm wondering if it's more productive just to prove what is true. In other words, what you did with Mehdi Hassan, and it's funny because the subject and motion of that debate is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. So you would think it's a debate about hate, but really it's a debate about truth. And the moment where you demonstrated that Mehdi Hassan was being incredibly dishonest, we can play the clip, where you uncovered sort of a sophistry play that he's doing, is so much more effective than just trying to tell people what's going on inside of his heart and what's motivating some of these people from a charge of anti-Semitism, because I think showing instead of telling is so much more effective. So can you speak to that a little bit, as far as a lot of advocacy groups, even on the pro-Israel, pro-Zionist side, spending all this energy and research to prove who's hateful rather than proving just what's true?
I think the truth, and this comes into the international law arena hugely, it is at the core also of what is likely to save us from this. So it goes spot on to your previous concerns. The truth is on our side. The law is on our side. And I think increasingly when we're looking at that sort of silent majority or the movable middle, they are the ones likely to be most impacted when that truth comes out. And I do believe that the truth will out eventually, not least because it's important to bear in mind that Israel might be the initial target here, but what starts with the Jews will not end with the Jews. And that especially as the misinformation about international law is taking hold, it is Western civilization as a whole that will be the ultimate target. So I think the key to that is knowledge, and the more that we can arm people, reasonable people, who understand perhaps, in their kitschkas, who's on the side of right and wrong here.
Jewish podcast. Yeah.
The more that we can arm those people with the facts and enable them to push back on those false narratives, that the more likely we are, I think, to see a way through here. So that's critical.
Yeah, I would say that, not to push back on that, I think it's true, but there's also this problem where we're like 18 months in since the 7th, and now we're seeing one narrative and another narrative. They're both competing for that movable middle. And I think while you guys won the monk debate, in general in the public, the movable middle is confused and I think misguided on what things look like, because we try to sometimes use facts to combat emotional images or the optics of war. In other words, we'll say something like, there's images out of Gaza and war that are horrific, and we acknowledge that, and we'll say, but that Israel has the lowest combatant to civilian ratio ever. And I don't think somebody who's moved by a horrific image listens to that fact and goes, you know what? You're right. Doesn't bother me anymore.
I mean, you're absolutely right. And the real difficulty here, and this comes back to your question vis-a-vis Mehdi Hassan, is that it is so much harder to combat these falsehoods with facts, because the facts are ultimately more complicated than the falsehoods that are being propagated.
Right. There's this very simple moral argument of you can't kill 40,000 people. How do you argue against that?
By attributing the responsibility appropriately with Hamas. So it's another aspect of the misinformation here is the infantilization of the Palestinians and the removal of any responsibility for Hamas from the equation. I'm astounded that the first individual, and you can do a wonderful impression of him, essentially to have come out and taken a humanitarian perspective on the Palestinians in Gaza. And this is President Trump.
I knew it was coming. I knew it.
Saying that these people should be allowed to leave a war zone if they so choose. There was if you listen to all of the recordings of his remarks on this, there was no mention of the word forcible. There was no insinuation of it, and yet
a nudge, a light little nudge. But you're right, but then they can't be used, Natasha. If they leave, they cannot be used.
Well, this is the critical aspect. The world, the international community, who profess to care about those civilians, and this is why I don't accept that they do. Because if they did, not only would they have been calling for the border to be opened for civilians to be able to flee, but they would have been calling on Egypt to comply with its obligations, its real obligations under international law, to facilitate the safe passage of civilians fleeing civil disorder. And we haven't heard any of that. So it's the picking and choosing and the inversion of actual international law here, and the complete abandonment of the Palestinian people, the civilians, the Palestinian Arabs, and the recognition, which is critical, that it is in fact Israel that has historically and today done more for the ordinary Palestinian civilians than any other entity in the Arab world, is, I think, the critical fact to get across to properly engage with those images. And that's before, we put aside all of the fabricated images, those of children from Syria representing them as though they're in Gaza, or this phenomenon of Pallywood and now Gaza wood that we're seeing develop. I think the critical aspect of this is the fact that the international media has been parroting Hamas propaganda. Everything coming out of Gaza over the last 15 months is what Hamas wants the world to see. And I would have expected journalists with integrity to acknowledge that and say, we are restricted in what we can report. This is all under Hamas control. And I haven't heard any of that, not from the BBC, CNN, MSNBC, at all. So that is the phenomenon that we're grappling with. But I think the way through it is to acknowledge that war is horrific and to acknowledge the suffering of some ordinary civilians here alongside dispelling Hamas propaganda. And if that's on the casualty figures, if that's on the way that these people have died, because we know civilians have been shot by Hamas, either because they are seeking to flee according to Israeli guidelines or because they are seeking aid and they've been shot in the process of trying to access that aid that Hamas has been controlling and diverting, or because Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad rockets fall short in the Gaza Strip, killing indiscriminately. Unlike Israeli strikes that are targeted, that are assessed as to proportionality, and that are preceded by warnings, those rockets intended for Israeli civilians are fired indiscriminately. And when they fall in the Gaza Strip, they kill indiscriminately.
Yeah, and I think also Israel is a victim of its own virtue in the sense that because it protects its civilians and you don't see the damage that you see in Gaza, even though it is a more powerful army, there's no question, because it invests in protecting its civilians, in terms of sympathy from the world, they see Tel Aviv looking pretty good and they see Gaza looking pretty bad. But I think we answer always those curiosities and those questions from a sympathetic, impartial, movable middle with the wrong facts. They'll say, they'll throw out a stat of how it conducts war rather than acknowledging or attributing properly to the right. There's a right answer, but it's to the wrong question, and vice versa. People are looking to explain what's going on here, and we're giving them data points that don't compute, and that's why I don't think it's persuasive, even though it's true.
That's fair.
As a barrister, can I say lawyer? Do I have to say barrister?
You can say whatever you like.
I want to say barrister. As a barrister,
it's a lot more polite than a lot of the comments on
As a Jewish barrister, do you when
one of them Jew law people?
Is your point of view like argument construction? Like when you see something happen, are you like, oh, this is how they can explain this in a way that makes them look good? Here's how a way we can explain this in a way that makes them look bad. Like, is that the place your brain goes to first? Like structuring this as an argument?
That's a very good question.
Thank you.
And the answer is I don't really know. I think just, from many, many years of doing it, perhaps it just happens instinctively. It helps that every one of these examples, albeit that they may seem to be new on the basis of, today's news cycle, is invariably a rehash of the libel that they've propagated 70,000 times before. It's just a new version of it. And the pattern that seems to exist is international media point the finger at Israel. And the latest example of this was the reports of 15 aid workers, or ambulance workers, being shot. And then there was the New York Times video, which on proper analysis revealed that some of the individuals that they purported to consider to be ambulance workers were visibly armed. And
that was like the 8-minute video that was going around Twitter.
From the phone.
Yes.
And that is actually consistent with the response that Israel put out, which said that a significant number of those that have been killed were in fact affiliated with Hamas. But that pattern of story comes out, spreads like wildfire, is ultimately debunked. And then nobody really remembers or is around anymore for the rectification.
Right.
That is now pretty common, but it feeds into the hysteria that we have seen and the increasing nature, the sort of fantastical nature of the allegations. So one recently, I think, was Francesca Albanese suggesting that Israelis were practicing cannibalism. Now, there is a projection element of that, because I remember in the year 2000 when two reservists found themselves in Ramallah. They were lost. They went to a local police station looking for assistance, and they were lynched. And in fact, that red hand symbol is said to emanate from that incident, because one of the lynchers held up his hands to the window in the baying crowd below, took delight in this scene. And there were also reports and images at the time of the attackers eating the innards of these two individuals, their livers. And in fact, Yahya Sinwar used very similar language when he was calling sometime before the 7th of October to break down the border and slaughter Jews to eat their livers. So that tracking of what it is that they, in this case, the Palestinian Arabs, have done to or have professed to do to Israelis and Jews, they are similarly levying those allegations against the real victims.
Let's get into that brass tacks a little bit on the specifics, because you said something when we were at this conference that I thought was fascinating, and I think you've said it in other interviews before, this idea of projection, that everything that Israel has been accused of is actually things that have been done to it. Can you unpack those different things, what you mentioned, from apartheid, colonialism, genocide, ethnic cleansing? Like, you really detailed it in an interesting way, that a lot of this is this perverse projection that gets libeled at Israel.
So this cannibalism example is perhaps the latest of it, but it's pervasive throughout the weaponization of international law against Israel. If I start with the term occupation, Israelis, before the establishment of the State of Israel, the Jewish Yishuv was ultimately under occupation. There were the Ottoman Turks and their colonial enterprise, their empire. Then there are many who argue that the British Mandate was a form of occupation. It was also colonial in nature. Similarly, this allegation of ethnic cleansing. I mean, let's think about the real ethnic cleansing in the Middle East. Where are the Jews? That very famous speech by Hillel Neuer of UN Watch at the UN asking
Libya,
Arab
where are you
states-
Jews? Yemen, where are you Jews? Algeria, where are you Jews?
You see, I'm setting all of these up specifically for
A Hillel Neuer impression, you did not see that coming. UN Watch, go check it out. But yes, okay. So
the real ethnic cleansing is the fact that the Arab world is essentially Jew-free. But of course, we saw that in East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria when the Jordanians were in occupation, Jews were ethnically cleansed. In areas A and B, which are controlled by the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, Jews have been ethnically cleansed. Not only that, when I was there 2 weeks ago, again, I saw the big red signs that warn any Israelis of going into these areas for the reason that these two reservists were lynched in Ramallah in the year 2000. And of course, they don't mean, I know they say these signs, Israelis, they don't mean that.
Yahud. They mean Jews.
Because Israeli Arabs are free to come and go as they please. And I saw that when I was there. So that is the real ethnic cleansing. That's also the real apartheid, when you consider that you cannot, as a Jew, live in Palestinian-controlled territory. And let's not forget that the reason that the Palestinians have an autonomy is because Israel ceded that area to what was then created as the Palestinian Authority in the Oslo Accords. Similarly, there are no Jews in Gaza, apart from those that are still being held hostage, 59 of them in the tunnels. And that is because, likewise, Israel ethnically cleansed the Jews from Gaza in the year 2000 when, in pursuit of peace, it unilaterally withdrew from that territory. And then we come to this, and so colonialism we've discussed as well. When you consider that Jews are indigenous to Judea and that Israel is ultimately the decolonization success story, it's extraordinary that it would be accused of colonialism in the Middle East. I mean, just look at a map of the Middle East and you can see what Arab colonialism has achieved vis-a-vis tiny little Israel. And they're trying to stamp that little postage stamp out as well. Then we come to this question of genocide. And here we also see this sort of new, I call it a new inversion, but I remember, and I listened back to it recently, actually. I did an interview in 2014 in Sukeitan, Protective Edge, and this was actually also on LBC. It was a lengthy debate in which my opponent was consistently accusing Israel of genocide, even then. So it's not a new allegation, but it similarly inverts the term and accuses the victims of the crime of perpetrating the very acts that were committed against them. I don't just mean the acts that gave rise to the term genocide from the Holocaust, but also the experience of Jews on the 7th of October because they were targeted by Hamas for being Jews, for murder, rape, slaughter, torture, and kidnap. And so in each of these contexts, and it ties into your earlier comments on the way that the lies and misinformation really take hold, it's a very simple, straightforward narrative. It's false, and it takes a lot to start to unpack it. But I think when people recognize that they have been lied to, that the wool has been pulled over their eyes, and they open themselves up to understanding the realities here, you find, and I've experienced this over the last 15 months and people writing to me from all over the world, you find real allies who are committed to understanding the reality and then to talking about it as much as possible.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting because of the whole concept of what you're talking about, the wool is pulled over their eyes and then it's revealed to them. It's like this whole conversation, speaking of inversion, is both sides being at odds based on what they claim are the same values, which is so weird. As in other words, they say that Israel are Nazis, and Israel says Hamas is Nazis. I think the facts bear out based on the espoused views of each group of which one aligns with reality.
And they both hate Nazis.
Exactly. So it's just so strange, especially if this is from the far left anti-Semitism, the far left anti-Zionism, where they both claim to be for these human rights and against genocide. I mean, the far right we can talk about a little later because they're actually for, they actually have more proudly anti-Western, anti-illiberal views. But what's interesting is like wool pulled over your eyes. There's a lot of people on the anti-Zionist sort of Jewish side who say the wool was pulled over my eyes. And once I saw the brutal, I mean, an example of this, like Dave Smith, the comedian who's been making, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but he's been making rounds on Rogan and Lex Fridman on all these podcasts. And, you know, he's not one of these guys who's from the river to the sea. He's not pro-Hamas, but his whole thing is the sacred cow for that argument is this brutal occupation that's been going on since 1967 is a disaster. That's what he sounds like. But he's from Long Island. But basically, as long as that's been going on since 67, like, what do you expect to happen? Israel's got its boot on the neck of the Palestinians. So I just want to go a little deeper on the actual reality of the life in the West Bank, the conditions of what they call an occupation, the autonomy. Like a lot of these things are just claims that the pro-Israel side just kind of almost lets go at this point, like accepting that. Yeah, that's what I mean.
The first question,
settlements, brutal. Like they're just, they are expanding in settlements. Maybe they shouldn't do that. We let a lot of these stuff go, and these are just like claims and statements made by the anti-Zionist side that you're just like, wait a minute, on facts alone, you're wrong. So like. Tell me a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Do you want to get into specifics?
Sure.
Yeah. So Dave Smith, this comedian, was just on Lex Fridman. You know Lex Fridman.
Yeah.
And he was making his case against Israel basically. And I just took notes. We both took notes about like some specific things we take for granted that we wanted to ask you because I don't know how to respond to it. It feels wrong to me, but I don't actually know. I mean, so one thing he says is like, talking about the West Bank, he's like, Palestinians don't have any rights. Since 1967, they haven't had any rights. They don't have trial by jury. They don't have any rights. So basically the conclusion is, what do you expect? After like 50 years of this, 70 years of this, things are, it's. And he said earlier, October 7th was an indictment of that entire experience that they've been.
That sounds like it's oddly like justification, doesn't it?
Right. So I mean, what are the Palestinians in the West Bank entitled to rights? Meaning, like, are they like who's entitled to right? A citizen? Like, what are they exactly?
And not natural rights, legal rights, residency rights.
And what rights do they have?
Well, those that live under the Palestinian Authority, which I explained was established through the Oslo Accords, should be voting for their leadership. Unfortunately, there was one election and never again. Mahmoud Abbas, I think, is now in the 20th year of his 4-year term. And it's true that the Palestinians are appallingly treated by their leadership, by the PA, in the West Bank and have been subjugated by Hamas since their violent takeover in 2007 in the Gaza Strip. But Israel has nothing to do with either of those situations. We come on to this concept of occupation, and I think the first question you need to ask is, who was it occupied from? To which invariably these people have no answer, because the reality of the situation is that ever since Israel's declaration of independence in 1948, and international law is very clear on what Israel's borders were automatically by default in 1948. Absent there being any agreement to the contrary, Israel inherits the pre-existing administrative lines of the British mandate that preceded it. So the territory that we're talking about was originally Israeli sovereign territory. And then you have to ask yourself from a legal point of view, when, if ever, has that status changed? And the answer is there has never been any form of agreement to change that original status. the underlying status. And what we have seen in the West Bank is a series of legal frameworks, administrative frameworks, first in 1967, when Israel recovered that territory from Jordanian occupation. Israel instituted what was supposed to be a temporary administration.
Wait, sorry. Can I ask a question because I'm a little confused? So
course.
that land in the West Bank was given to Israel in 1948?
Wasn't given.
It was yeah.
It
okay.
was. So this rule, called Otipos Adetis Iuris, is a rule that is established to create clean lines, stability, certainty, to prevent fratricidal struggles. And it developed to provide that certainty by simply going according to whatever the pre-existing administrative boundaries of a former colonial unit were. So when the new state emerged, so for example, at the dissolution of the former Soviet Union, or with the Spanish withdrawal from South America, this was also applied in Asia and in Africa. And in all of these contexts, the pre-existing administrative lines become the borders
state.
of the newly emerging state at the moment of independence.
In a time
and then what happened?
when you're carving up states, like this is the precedent, like a colonial force leaves, we have to carve up states based on boundaries. Where do we draw those lines? And you base it on the administrative colonial entity that preceded it.
So this is in fact a default rule that applies where there has been no drawing of lines or determining of boundaries. So if you think about partition, which was applied in India and Pakistan, there was an agreement on partition that was implemented. The partition proposal that was made before the establishment of the State of Israel, which is not legally binding, it's a General Assembly resolution, which was a recommendation, which was never accepted by the Arab population or Israel's Arab neighbours, so it was never implemented. So absent any agreement as to what boundaries ought to be, the only lines in play are those of the pre-existing administrative unit, the British Mandate. And when you think about the severance of Jordan, Transjordan, which later became the Hashemite Kingdom, the line that we're talking about in terms of Judea and Samaria and East Jerusalem is the line that divided administratively the Transjordan part of the Palestine Mandate from the rest of it. And so when that was severed, this is the administrative line that we're talking about. And it's significant because it doesn't require Israel to state that this is its territory. It doesn't even require Israel to control that territory. And of course, pretty immediately, Jordan invades and it occupies East Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria. And likewise, Egypt does the same with Gaza. So
Like in 1948?
In 1948 and
the War,
1949, yeah.
Okay.
And so
they
that's
assumed
where
control of of the West Bank as part of Jordan.
and ethnically cleansed it of its Jews. In
Right.
fact, my ancestor's gravestone was taken by the Jordanians and used to pave a nearby road. And this was all discovered when Israel recovered the old city in 1967. But it's interesting because all of the agreements that do exist, the armistice agreements, which gave rise to what people call, the Green Line, or what they erroneously call the 1967 borders, because they don't date from 1967 and they're not borders. This is, in fact, the 1949 armistice line, which was
Is
agreed.
that Dayan who drew it? Who drew it on the map?
It was agreed by
That green line, though. That's
the Green Line demarcated essentially where the fighting forces had reached at the end of Israel's independence war. And Egypt and Jordan signed armistice agreements, which made it clear that they recognized Israel in no borders, but they referenced back to the administrative lines of the British Mandate, because these were the only lines in play. So as a matter of fundamental international law, this is the starting point. Then the question becomes, well, what political negotiations need to be entered into to resolve the issues over this disputed territory? And Israel has repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to negotiate over this land. And that's why, when it recovered this territory in 1967, it didn't apply its law, administration, and jurisdiction in full to Judea and Samaria in the way that it did to East Jerusalem. And it said, this is the reunification of the city. It is never to be divided again. Israel instituted, and this is now coming to answer your question, a temporary administrative framework in the West Bank where it applied certain aspects of the law of occupation. That does not mean that the territory is occupied. This is the framework that Israel applied until the Oslo Accords, and then we had a new framework with areas A, B, and C that had the blessing of the international community.
Remind me, what year was the Oslo Accords? It was
1992 and 1993.
92, yeah. Okay.
So when people say that Palestinian Arabs living in the West Bank are subject to different laws, there are two important layers of that to be aware of. One is, of course, Palestinian Authority law, because they govern areas A and B, which many people seem to be unaware of. But the other is the legal framework that Israel applied, which mandates, for example, that Israel have military courts in the West Bank, in particular in Area C, where it has retained administrative and security control. And that is mandated by Article 66 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and it is adhered to in order to provide that framework for Arabs who are not Israeli citizens. Now, Israeli citizens are subject to Israeli civil law wherever they are in the world. And that's why you get this differential. It's not discriminatory. It's not apartheid. It is based on whether or not you are a citizen of Israel or not. It's the sort of distinction that every country makes, in that it grants its citizens rights but also different responsibilities to non-citizens. And it is as a function of law that this is given rise to.
A point of clarification, I mean, Area B is mixed Jew and Arab, and it's ruled by Palestinian Authority? I always thought it was A is Arab, B is mixed, and C is Jewish.
So B is Israeli security control, but Palestinian Authority civil control. So when it comes to planning and zoning, or the taking out of the rubbish, which unfortunately the Palestinian Authority doesn't seem to be garbage, doesn't seem to be interested in. Whenever I've been in the West Bank, unfortunately, this is in Ramallah, one thing that is really recognizable is the garbage pile up everywhere.
Yeah. Right. So the PA should be taking care of it, but it doesn't.
Because Mahmoud Abbas prefers to come to the United Nations and slam his fist on the table and play the part of world leader rather than take the trash out.
So when Dave Smith says you don't have rights, like let's say I'm a Palestinian Arab living in the West Bank and I'm accused of murder. Like whose court do I go to? Do I go to the PA's court? Do I go to an Israeli court? Do I go to a military court?
It depends where geographically and the individuals involved. So if there are Israeli citizens in Area C.
So how can you be? So sorry, I'm like pretty ignorant. So how can you be an Israeli citizen in the West Bank?
If you are living in Area C, there are what are referred to as Israeli settlements, and this comes to your question about what one says.
Communities, people. Can we just call it what it is? I mean, settlement. It's taken on such a connotation, but it's so because it's really designated by people who don't go and don't see and don't know on the ground. But it's like sort of this point of judgment. They call it the settlements. And what were you going to say? I cut you off.
The pioneers here in the United States established settlements. All of Israel was a settlement. And in fact, the word in Hebrew doesn't have the kind of connotation that you've rightly identified this now has in the English language because of the misinformation war surrounding it. But ultimately, at its core, it's this notion that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live in certain areas simply because they're Jews.
Right.
And this has bafflingly been accepted and embraced by the international community, not just in Area A, where the Palestinian Authority has ensured that the area is Judenrein, is free of Jews, but now the international community seems to be claiming that the entirety of Judea and Samaria, which I say as a non-religious person, is the biblical heartland, is tremendously important to many of the people who live there. But all of that is swept aside on the basis that Jews shouldn't be allowed to live there just because they're Jews.
How progressive that Palestine has to be free of Jews in order to be free. But it's all technically fascinating and interesting when you dissect this, but it does boil down to a certain problem that I think a lot of people in the West aren't appreciative of, which is the idea that the nation state of Israel in its current form exists partially and motivated by this idea of Jewish security and safety, and that Israel must maintain a Jewish majority population, even though it protects the rights of its minorities fully that live within it, so that Jews can have a state of their own and a sense of security. And lessons have been learned throughout history, even recent history, of why that's required. And even people sympathetic to that. The issue is, in 1967 and in Oslo, making these concessions, it's like the people on the left will say the occupation cannot continue or we won't have peace. And the people on the right will say the same thing. We need to take this and make it part of Israel proper and annex it. And enough of this nonsense, because when you don't assert your control over this area properly, and we all of a sudden increase our security risks. Like, the real issue fundamentally is that if Israel found itself with a majority Arab population, the Jews living within it would be endangered just like they were in every other Arab society in the Middle East. So this whole notion of Israel having to try to maintain its democratic values while being a Jewish state, isn't that the fundamental problem of why the West Bank is not a part of Israel? The Area C is, but effectively, like, the rubber meets the road at that moment, no?
I would say not necessarily. I think ultimately the reason for it is that in 1967, Moshe Dayan and others took a pragmatic view that under the land for peace formula, some of Judea and Samaria would be given to Jordan in exchange for peace, whether or not the Jordanians had any legitimate claim to it or not. And for the record, there was no legitimate Jordanian claim to that area. But that is what preceded the temporary administration, because you're not going to apply your law, administration and jurisdiction in full to territory that you anticipate at some point giving away in pursuit of peace. Now, that temporary administration lasted well over 50 years, and therein lies the tricky aspect of this, because there was never a proper settled application of Israeli civilian law to that part of the world. And what a lot of people are incorrectly calling annexation, that term needs to be absolutely expunged, because you cannot annex what is already your own sovereign territory. What they are in fact talking about is the application of Israeli civil law to Area C. We're not talking about areas A and B, because that is already being governed by the Palestinian Authority, the Palestinian autonomy, the self-governance that they have been given. But that is, I think, an important clarification. More broadly, this question of demographics is one that is hotly debated in both directions. And it's probably not for me to go into, the numbers of children that Jews versus Arabs are necessarily having in Israel. What I think is instructive is what we saw after the 7th of October, because so many predicted that, inspired by what can only be called the relative success of Hamas on that day, not only would Hezbollah join in from the north, but the Israeli Arab population would be encouraged to similarly attack their Jewish neighbours, and likewise there would be attempts from the West Bank to infiltrate into Jewish communities. We didn't see that. And not only did we not see that, we in so many cases saw the exact opposite. We saw so many Israeli Arabs who hadn't necessarily been outspoken before, saying for the first time, Ein li eretz acheret, I have no other country. Arabs that recognize that they are the only free Arabs in the Middle East, and how lucky they are to live, work, prosper in a society in which, in the Jewish state, they can be members of the police force. They can serve in the army. I served under an Arab justice in the Supreme Court when I worked there nearly 10 years ago now. They serve in the Knesset, and some of them do so without even calling for the destruction of the State of Israel. So there's some progress here. And that speaks volumes for the future prosperity and success of Israel, being a democratic and Jewish state, but a state that enables all citizens to prosper without discrimination and with equal rights under the law. And that's where I take great hope and optimism from.
I go so back and forth on this, right? Because you hear also the flip side, people within Israeli society, or you hear about terrorist attacks within Israel from Israeli Arabs, or you hear about people, somebody told me that this terrible story about they were in a hospital and one of the Arab nurses told them that the Arab doctors, there's these weird cultural elements of a sense of allegiance to the general Arab world, that even though, yes, we live under Israel and we appreciate that, at the end of the day, we have to side with, our Arab brethren and for that cause. And there's this sort of Islamic obligation to liberate this land because it was once under Muslim control. And there's that theological component to it, which is always hard to know how many within a population ascribe to it, So
it's impossible to know, because even those who may share the sentiments that I outlined may not feel comfortable expressing it publicly.
Right.
So I'm not saying by any stretch of the imagination that this is universal, but it does exist. And the critical factor here is that it is increasing. And that is what I think is the positive trajectory. in particular, when we look at hospitals and we see, Jewish and Muslim, Arab nurses working side by side, it is that exposure to the other from the Arab world's perspective, which is so critical, because when you think about, Israel's withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, it meant that since 2005, those Palestinians growing up in Gaza had never seen a Jew in real life unless they were coming into Israel to work. For many of them who crossed the border on the 7th of October in that barbaric rampage of slaughter, they were seeing Jews for the first time. And actually, if you are growing up in a society where and this is unique, I cannot think of another country where, faced with this dynamic, as you've described, where there are people within the country that have an allegiance to a movement that is seeking your destruction, and that might even celebrate what happened on the 7th of October, that they are nonetheless valued as equal citizens with full rights. I mean, that is extraordinary, and it is something that I think...
Now they have it. It's in the UK now.
Well, it's different.
Soon by you. Yeah.
It is slightly different in the way that the situation in the UK has come about, whereas in Israel's case, a decision was made in furtherance of its democratic principles to embrace these people, even though many of them may have, sought Israel's destruction in the
48 Arabs that became part of Israel's society.
Precisely, and that I think is unprecedented.
What about the idea that Palestinians already have a state? It's called Jordan. People say it kind of flippantly, but I mean, Jordan is how much percent Palestinian in terms of population? And they're culpable in the wars of 67, and why not say, hey, you started this, you lost, like you're responsible for the consequences and the well-being and the looking after of Arabs in the West Bank and being part of Jordan?
So I think there are a few things to say on that. Firstly, going back to the creation of the Hashemite Kingdom, it came from the entirety of the Palestine Mandate. People seem to forget that. And so when one thinks about this division between Jews and Arabs, 3/4 of the Mandate became a state for the Arabs. And there are many people who I think with some correctness call that out. The difficulty is that, the Hashemites have had their own problems with the Palestinian population and are fearful.
Wasn't he like a Saudi guy that was like installed, the Hashemite thing?
So the British had made promises to the Hashemites, and this was the fulfillment, indeed.
You get Jordan.
Of this is the colonial diplomacy, if you will. But it's significant that what remained, that last quarter of the mandate, was significantly less than so much of the Jewish community pre-state had anticipated. They'd been looking at Jordan included. And so for them, that was already a major compromise before this further discussion of further division started to occur. That further division that never, in fact, occurred, that never culminated. But it's also important to think about the Arab responsibility here. It is extraordinary, and in fact, Einat Wilf and Adi Schwartz have written brilliantly on this, I think, in the context of their book, The War of Return, about the shifting of responsibility for Palestinian Arabs, as they essentially later became known as. At the time, it was just the local Arab population. This is an important point, actually. My grandparents were Palestinians. They were Jews living in the Palestine Mandate. And they had identity cards issued to them by the British, which said nationality Palestinian, race Jewish. The concept of exclusively Arab Palestinian national identity came much, much later in the 1960s with Yasser Arafat.
Who was from Egypt.
Born in Cairo,
Nice.
Precisely.
Fun fact. Yeah.
So that is a very important factor to bear in mind, and it goes to this misinformation and the false narratives and false historical narratives, which we definitely need to be tackling. I've forgotten the original question now.
What was the original question? Jordan being
Jordan.
Palestinian.
Yes. So
can't Jordan just be Palestine?
What I would just
Twice Palestinian, right?
What I would just say is that in terms of Arab responsibility towards that local population, who have been termed now refugees uniquely for generations, and this goes to the crux of the War of Return book, the establishment of UNRWA which is an agency specifically for Palestinian refugees, which adhere to a definition which is specifically for them. This was all pretty carefully thought out as a continual thorn in Israel's side, as the continual pawn to push for Israel's destruction. But the flip side of it has meant that Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, none of them have actually taken responsibility for the individuals that came to these places. They have kept them in refugee camps for generations, and the Palestinians in Jordan are a case in point. They are discriminated against, they are oppressed, they are treated as second-class citizens. We don't hear about any of this.
There are
in the
Palestinian
international
refugees
media.
in Jordan currently with our second-class citizens as we speak.
That are called refugees despite having lived there now for generations.
Do you know if they have like full rights there? Are they citizens?
They certainly
of
don't
Jordan?
have full rights. And that's the critical question here. And part of the reluctance of the Hashemites to treat them better is fear. For the same reason that Egypt didn't want to allow a single Palestinian into the Sinai because they are terrified of Hamas, which is essentially the Muslim Brotherhood. And the rest of the world understands, what happened in Lebanon with Palestinian terrorism. The rest of the world understands far better, so the rest of the Arab world understands far better than the West what is at play here and what the dangers and concerns arising from this particular population
It's
are.
only Israel that people have no issue putting the pressure on to assume the risk of all of this in terms of security. No other country seems to get any pressure at all to deal with it.
Do you think it's because in the international community, Israel is considered more like Western and more like everybody else, so they're held to a higher standard, and it's sort of maybe this sort of subconscious racism of like, the Arabs,
Soft
they
bigotry
just
of low
do their thing,
expectations.
but like Israel's like Britain and America, so we should expect more from them.
Which to a certain extent is I want to say fair enough, because Israel is a democracy and holds itself
Right.
to those very high standards. But what that equation fails to understand is that Israel is not living next to Switzerland. And it's in a very, very different neighborhood. It also, though, if only that was the extent of it, the problem is that quite apart from holding Israel to that much higher standard, the facts, the law, the reality is then continually inverted to generate what are essentially the modern blood libels against the Jewish state, those untrue allegations which are added into the mix.
We are coming up on the end of this conversation, but I have a few lightning round questions, and then we'll finish up. One of them was another thing that Dave Smith, because he's been making all these rounds, loves to throw out in terms of like speaking legalese and conflating things in legal terms is, in terms of the laws of war, he's often saying, unless you absolutely have to do this, when Israel is targeting a terrorist and there's collateral damage, that is murder in the first degree. Murder in the first degree. You're a lawyer, a barrister. Is that murder in the first degree? Is collateral damage in war unintended consequences of trying to target a terrorist and there's collateral damage? Is that murder in the first degree, legally speaking?
Legally, it's illiterate.
Sit with that.
The whole concept, though, of the laws of armed conflict, and this is quite difficult for non-military individuals or non-military lawyers to internalize, is that it is proceeding on the basis that innocents will die. That is, unfortunately, horrifically, a reality of warfare. Quite apart from the tactics that Hamas deploy with the use of human shields, where they continually seek to murder as many civilians themselves, both on the Israeli side, but also cause as much civilian collateral damage on the Gaza side. And one of the things I would say, I don't know how real these images of children being taken out of the rubble are. And we have to take everything coming out of Gaza with a pinch of salt. As I mentioned, this is Hamas propaganda. But to the extent that there are children over the last couple of weeks that have been moved to areas where Israel has identified it will be striking and has issued warnings. Where is the international outcry that Hamas has done this? It's extraordinary. To clarify the application of the law on this, military action that is necessary can be taken. That is the purpose of conducting armed conflict, all in pursuit of your military objectives. You have to take that action, as I say, that it is necessary. You have to distinguish between civilians and combatants, which Israel does. And
Hamas doesn't yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And it's its military strategy, it's its modus operandi. But critically, this concept of proportionality is continually misrepresented. And that is not about balancing casualties on both sides or creating this kind of macabre, well, you can only kill 2 civilians because there are only 2 on your side. That is utterly incredible, untrue, outrageous, but it also serves to encourage Hamas in its use of civilians as human shields, and so it needs to be called out. The rule of proportionality requires that you balance the anticipated civilian or collateral damage as against the anticipated military advantage of any strike. And that is a very delicate balance. It is conducted on the basis of the intelligence that it is known. So all of this is an intention-based analysis, not an effects-based analysis. And it is something that Israel has consistently adhered to. And these are standards that actually go above the requirements of international law. And modern militaries, moral armies, like from the United States, like from the UK, have sent individuals, and in fact I went into Gaza with a military expert panel in September, with very senior army officers from 6 NATO states who all said, we have never seen these measures taken to prevent civilian casualties, to protect civilians, to provide warnings of strikes. And the proportionality analysis that Israel conducts on a strike-by-strike basis is also in that intensity and level of urban armed conflict entirely unprecedented. So for all of those reasons, I'm afraid that gentleman is very badly mistaken.
But remember, there's a lot of people that, and Dave I wouldn't include in this, but especially on the left-wing critiques of Zionism in Israel, they hate virtue, and therefore to be more virtuous makes them angrier. So it's an interesting thing when Israel constantly is trying to appease its haters by showcasing its moral virtue and superiority. It only makes them angrier. Just a point to be made there.
That was not a lightning round.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Well, we got Natasha here. There's no lightning round. Last thing is, they asked President Trump in the recent press conference, under what authority do you have to take over the Gaza Strip? And he goes, under U.S. authority. So let's take him to the task on that. Can we take over the Gaza Strip? Is there any kind of precedent for that? Or is that just bluster?
Well, one form of analysis on it would be that this is terra nullis. So this is territory that Israel abandoned in 2005. Either Israel could recover that territory, perhaps lease it to the Americans. That would be one legal framework. Or if the
Israeli landlords are the worst. I don't know. It's just, listen, it's all, we fix it in a minute. We're waiting. We're building and then we're building again. It's going to take time. Leasing.
If you think about Antarctica, this would be a parallel of territory that is not part of a sovereign state.
Right.
Hamas is not sovereign in Gaza.
So you mean like it's up for grabs, like kind of thing? I mean, to be, not to...
Strictly,
whatever.
Legally speaking.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, the practicalities around that, of course, are of a completely different order.
Right.
And certainly my understanding of President Trump's remarks are not that he particularly wanted to take responsibility for that part of land. He expected cooperation from neighbouring Arab states, perhaps the Abraham Accords countries. And clearly, in terms of providing a security framework on the ground, that is going to be necessary. I don't anticipate America wanting to do the
Well, it's beautiful
groundwork on
beachfront property. Don't
that I can actually attest to, having been along the Philadelphia corridor and onto the beach in Gaza. It is an absolute tragedy what the international community has allowed Hamas to do to that territory, to those people. And the sooner, with American support, that this is called out and that the lives of ordinary individuals, Israelis and Palestinians, are improved on the ground, the better.
Amen.
Do you say terra nullis in Trump's voice?
Terra nullis. We love terra nullis. Terra nullis. It's actually a condition I had in my lower back. A little terra nullis, but I took some Tylenol and the swelling went down from my terra nullis.
One of the best terra nullises.
Natasha, thank you so much for this enlightening. I learned a lot.
I have so many more questions.
Oh
I could do another 2 hours.
We could do another 2 hours.
Yeah.
We'll have to do it again the next time you're in town.
I look forward to it.
Any advice to the people out there in the debate space, like some of the worst pro-Israel arguments you hear where people, I think, were answering the wrong questions with the wrong facts, even if they are standalone facts? So your general advice out there and your approach and strategy, which is very effective, can you just sum up that approach and that strategy that you think is most effective, just to wrap it up here?
I think it helps when you're in the right. And the fact that the law, the facts, the history, and the moral courage are all on our side is so significant. And it means that ultimately these arguments, if they are held in good faith, and in situations where people aren't cut off or thrown off the radio, then they can in fact be productive exchanges, and the truth will ultimately out.
Amen.
Am Yisrael Chai. What a good place to end. Thank you so much, Natasha Hausdorff.
Thank you.
UK Lawyers for Israel, a barrister and fierce proponent of truth. And we thank you for being here in Ami's house. Thank you.
It really has been my pleasure, Jen.
Gentlemen. Nice.